a portrait of the composer Arnold Bax, written and presented by Michael Oliver. The programme, first broadcast last year in Music Weekly, begins with the voice of Bax himself.
It has been suggested that all art derives from a sickness of the soul, just as a pearl is generated by a diseased oyster. A completely happy and healthy person, maintains this pessimist, would have no need for self-expression, and would be content to laze all day in the sun like an Italian workman. Be that as it may, I think the theory holds good in regard to much of the romantic, introspective literature and music of the last 100 years. The catastrophe of 1914 certainly threw a cloud upon the imaginations of men and bundled away dreams such as those in which I had hitherto indulged. Yet, despite the restless and somber mood of the world, or perhaps because of it, many creative artists managed to continue with their work and even gained in strength. The demon of the time seized upon us and forced us to his will. When my first symphony was performed in America, I mentioned in a program note that as far as I was aware, the harsh and stormy work was an example of pure music, unassociated with contemporary events. Whereupon a New York critic upbraided me as the quibbling Bax and added, "Of course this music from beginning to end represents the reaction of the composer's mind to the Great War." These are deep matters, and I must admit that scarcely ever in later years have I been tempted to seek again the ivory tower of my youth, even if I could find my way there.
Typical Bax. It has been suggested that art derives from a sickness of the soul, but he doesn't say clearly whether he agrees. The First Symphony is pure music, but to the suggestion that it's about World War I, he comments only, "These are deep matters," and then, in an apparent non sequitur, or covering his tracks, "I must admit," he says, why admit, "that scarcely ever in later years, not never, you notice, have I been tempted to seek again the ivory tower of my youth." And why did he add, "even if I could find my way there"? Bax hadn't always been so defensively reticent. His biographer, Lewis Forman.
Bax writes that he was absolutely certain that the only music that can last is that which is the outcome of one's emotional reactions to the ultimate realities of life, love and death. Now that is Bax's credo, and you have to read his works in the context of that statement. Bax went on elsewhere to define genius. The smug cliché has it that genius consists of an infinite capacity for taking pains. I myself think it probable that all that remains really vital in the work of artists throughout the ages has been given to the so-called creator with little or no conscious mental effort on his part. It may be true that one must have chaos in the heart if one could give truth to a dancing star, but no star was ever born of the struggling intellect. All that can be said with certainty is that the truly inspired artist doesn't possess a gift, but is possessed by it as by a demon.
That was written by a brazen romantic, as he called himself, with a reputation for music that's lush, richly coloured, drenched in Celtic twilight. It's one of many violent contradictions in Bax. We must begin at the beginning, a cultured family background and a very wealthy one. As a very young child, the High Court Judge Sir Melford Stevenson was a frequent guest of the Bax family, one of many frequent guests.
Mrs. Bax had a huge acquaintance among people, I think mostly of limited means, to whom she was unbelievably generous. She was known to a wide circle as Auntie Nellie, and the other recipients of her benefactions were known as her lame ducks, and I've never seen so many hungry people as there were around this vast dining room. I think they all had some artistic interest in common, not necessarily music. They certainly weren't anything to do with the theatre, because this is a somewhat strict congregational household. I used to stay at a large house that they had in those days in Hampstead called Ivy Bank. It was a house with a lot of grounds, and in those grounds was a music room which had been built for Arnold. And one day Arnold took me into this room, and he tried to make me reproduce a number of notes that he played on his piano. And he ultimately came to the conclusion that I was tone deaf, quite rightly. I think Arnold Bax properly and understandably regarded me as a crashing bore.
Bax was rather apt to call people tone deaf. Perhaps by his standards they were. His musical gifts grew, he said, as naturally as his hair grew or his teeth. Already in his teens he was an excellent pianist, and by all accounts a formidable score reader too, capable of playing the most complicated choral and orchestral pieces at sight. He began improvising at the piano around the age of 10 and composing not long after. By the way, another contradiction to ponder over. After his happy childhood and youth at Ivy Bank, presided over by the warm, strong character of his mother, I always thought she would have made a very good queen, Bax said of her. After Ivy Bank, Bax never had a home of his own again, a succession of flats and rented rooms mostly. He never bought a house, though he could have afforded several. He was ready for a full-time musical education by the time he was 16, and if he chose his place of study, it was a prescient choice.
The thing to remember is that Bax went to the Royal Academy of Music, and the teaching tradition at the Royal Academy and the composers who came from there have had a very bad press. Before the First World War, it was thought to be the revolutionary centre of the new British music, and the success, the publicity success of all the Stanford Parry pupils who came from the college have in fact almost made out that this was British music. And this isn't the case. The pupils of Frederick Corder at the Royal Academy, these composers were a very real alternative British music. Corder wrote in his book on orchestration, "The student finds the idiom of the past irksome and repellent. It's the vernacular he desires to learn," and then goes on to say, "Beauty is our one aim. Purely scientific composition, the fugue, the canon, the motet, and the madrigal, no longer appeal to the modern mind, and the goal of our ambition is the orchestral tone poem." So that I think Corder may have been laughed at by some people, and his teaching method certainly seems to have been a little peculiar, not as scientific as Stanford's, but he produced students who had a very individual voice.
He did indeed. Many years after Bax, Alan Bush was a pupil of Frederick Corder.
He was open to any composer who followed the style of Richard Wagner. Richard Wagner was his god. In fact, he had very little interest in Bach or Beethoven. I mean, we were introduced to the works of Brahms, but he didn't encourage us to study Brahms. He taught us, though he was not anxious to teach us, but he was obliged to teach us academic harmony and counterpoint in order for us to pass our exams. He was not interested in Palestrina at all. He did mention that there was such a composer, but he never had his works out on the piano or anything of that kind. He was very allergic to French music since Gounod. Gounod was one of his favourite composers, and Dvorak. Those are the two composers apart from Wagner to whom he introduced his pupils.
Well, there's precious little Dvorak or Gounod in Bax, though rather more of Wagner and another composer much promoted at the Academy, Liszt. What the Academy really did for Bax was to make him, at an impressionable age, open to impressions, open to the experiences that his comfortable circumstances made him free to explore, and he was passionately eager to explore. Perhaps the heart condition that had already been diagnosed sharpened his eagerness. He became convinced, he said, that 22 was the golden number in the count of a man's years. I longed to be 22 and to remain at that age forever. And so, during and immediately after his student years, he spent lengthy periods in Germany, where he was at the first production of Strauss's Salome, as well as visiting Norway and Eastern Europe. In England, he struck up friendships with poets and artists, as well as musicians. He met Elgar and mixed with the followers of William Morris. At the piano, he explored new music and old. And there were the still more important experiences of Ireland and of Russia, which we'll come back to. He also fell in love several times. We shall come back to that too. One of his friends at this time, Eleanor Fargen, said he was as sensitive as a candle flame. It's as though, hungrily seeking out experiences as if time were already running out, he was discovering the philosophy that he expressed many years later. I can't help being a primitive being. I believe in conditions of ecstasy, physical or spiritual, and I get nothing from anything else. I think all the composers who appeal to me, Beethoven, Wagner, Delius, Sibelius, were primitive in that they believed that the secret of the universe was to be solved by ecstatic intuition rather than by thought. I do believe that all original ideas derive from some condition of untrammeled passion and ecstasy. All this is by way of a prologue. Such a composer perhaps inevitably divides opinion, perhaps inevitably knew the extremes of fame and oblivion, perhaps inevitably wrote music of uneven quality. Can we justly assess him even now that his centenary year has passed? The conductor, Vernon Handley, a distinguished interpreter of Bax's music.
To me, the importance of a composer is in his establishing new moods and reaching out to a language which will eventually give a listener a different philosophic concept of life. And Bax does this. And I think the difficulty is not only because people tend, when playing him, or conductors when reading him, to link him with composers whose language really isn't like his at all, but just has a few superficial connections, either through orchestration or chromatic turns. But because the moods are more remote. For instance, if we say that Britain is very, very influenced by East Anglian mornings, it is not a criticism. The moment we say Celtic twilight about Bax, it is. And that's the nub of the question, that he reached out to moods which are Western and Northern and which are not readily accessible to people who live from the Midlands downwards. Unfortunately, we're doing the same thing with him as we did with Vaughan Williams and Holst, because when we look at Sibelius, because he's a foreign composer, it is all right for Sibelius to reach out to those northern stark moods, but not for an Englishman. And I think the other great difficulty is what someone said a long time ago, that it's very difficult to see the wood for the trees in Bax, because the beautiful melodies, the superb orchestration, and the very searching chromatic harmony tends to clothe the bones in such a way that we don't appreciate that the bones are there.
Bax's Fifth Symphony romantic, but scarcely brazen. Not much either of what one critic, shortly after Bax's death, called his soggy, shapeless, easy sentiment, nor of what has more than once been called his chromatic wallowing.
This is another misunderstanding of him, that because he has a searching chromatic harmonic language, we tend to link him with composers whose language we know better. When you first conduct Bach's with an orchestra that hasn't played any Bach's, they inevitably play it as a cross between Richard Strauss and Rachmaninoff. And it's only after a while that you can draw their attention to the fact that there's a great deal more polyphony in Bach's than either of those composers, and that there are often a lot more accents, that it is really tough music. The Romance of Yeats, it's not the Romance of Wordsworth. One of the characteristic moods of Bach's, and something that he achieves better than any other composer, I think, who ever lived, is this extraordinary strength of melancholy, which one does find, one has to turn to Celtic folklore and ideas here, one does find in the Celtic character, the visionary who is always seeking something and who's never quite satisfied. Because he is a romantic composer, and because he does deal in moods, and as he said himself, romantic states, emotional states, he will, by his unity in any symphony, I think particularly of the second, third and fourth symphonies, where all the movements grow out of material that he gives you very early on in the first pages of the symphony. He will, for that reason, create an overall mood for a symphony. You can characterize the fourth as bluff, and the third as sunny with clouds, and so on. But then these emotional states tend to suggest their program. They tend to ask you to enter a world where you will create your own feelings and stories. I mean, he's undoubtedly a man who's inspired more by the moods of nature than the moods of mankind. The first symphony particularly, I think, is weaker because it is contentious than, for instance, the Sixth Symphony, which is a much more universal mood symphony, because it is influenced not only by his experiences up to that point as a countryman, but also because of his grasp for much more universal moods, the kind of moods that Sibelius grasped in nature. It even makes me think of Sir Fred Hoyle's latest lecture, the Fremantle lecture, about universal intelligence, and whether composers who have gone through their romantic states have not reached out for the influence of universal intelligence drifting down through the atmosphere to us.
It's at moments like that, the epilogue to the Sixth Symphony, that one wonders where Bach's reputation as a rhapsodic wallower came from. From his lesser works, of course, and there's more than a few of them. There's another source as well, though, the composer and critic Anthony Payne.
Bach suffers from bad performances more than many late Romantic composers because of the complexity of his textures. I think performers sometimes don't realise where, to borrow the Schoenbergian term, where the Hauptstimme is. You just hear this wash of sound and they think of it as being texture, and in fact there's quite often a very strong line to be discerned, but the players don't somehow seem to be able to find it. I mean, there are contrapuntal elements in Bach's. You find that in the first and second symphonies, these great themes that spring right up from the bass like some primeval thing. That in fact is often a very, very powerful element in his scores, and it has to be brought out. I mean, a conductor has to be very sympathetic, because when you've got a whole orchestra with all sorts of layers of activity going on, you have to have an extremely sensitive conductor and have to have a lot of rehearsal time to get these things straight.
He's difficult in the way that Mozart is difficult, because as his themes undergo metamorphosis. So you have to move as a conductor. In this way, you have to convey to your orchestra very quickly that something that was, how can we put it, grotesque 2 moments ago is now extremely delicate and poised. That's hard to do. One thinks particularly of the third movement before the epilogue of the Third Symphony. The moods are changing by uneven groups of bars as quickly as he can state the material. So it is extremely difficult to get that across. Orchestras tend to go into the next mood with a hangover from the one they've just had, and because the language isn't familiar to them, it's very, very difficult for them to change.
All of which might suggest a wildly instinctive composer, listening to nature and responding to his passions without thought, as he rather providence-temptingly or critic-temptingly put it. Was he, in a word, a slapdash composer?
Bax was very concerned that his works were formally cogent, and there is not much luscious wallowing in Bax, but by and large I think the problem is that they have underlying programs, not some of them specific, others of them general, which we don't know. Certainly the first 2 symphonies, where he was sublimating particular personal events in archetypal terms, and I personally think that unless one appreciates the first 2 symphonies, one cannot assess Bax. Program notes for the first symphony do give you a bit of help. Various people have guessed that it was the First World War, which critics at the time came out with. It did just postdate the general breakup of his family background, him leaving his wife and his father dying. But I personally think the Civil War in Ireland is almost certainly the most persuasive of these various interpretations, and this is not necessarily Bax either giving a description of the events. This is Bax, the dreamer, throwing up a cry of despair at his dream having gone sour.
His music is certainly inspired from within, from his own personal life, from his emotions. I think there's no doubt about that. And I think that's where the great flaw is in Bax's artistic nature. He didn't have the ability to grow, I think, as a human being. It's interesting that if you read his letters and the things he was increasingly preoccupied with during the late 1930s and 1940s, they're always going on and on about how he was growing old and he would never be young again. He didn't have the sort of nature of the really great artists to make a triumph of old age. He could only see the sadness of growing old, and in some of his works this quality is extremely moving, very poignant, but it's a limiting factor in his music, and I think that's what happened to him. It was a personal failing. There's a really fantastically uninhibited quality about Bax when something seems to have touched him off, and of course it's usually to do with his own painful feelings or about his own emotional life. He's a very, very passionate and wild human being, and the sad thing is that when his own feelings began to give out, there was nothing to take their place artistically. I mean, not for him the late period of a Beethoven or a Bach, where you sort of get an Olympian detachment and a totally different way of looking at the world. When the fires burnt low with Bax, I think he was finished and was a very, very sad figure.
Yes, I think the fire literally went out of him. And although, as I say, he did write a number of very fine works, and perhaps more reasoned works than some of the passionate works of his earlier years, the power of the first and second symphonies I don't think was ever regained, except perhaps in passing. I mean, the climax of the Sixth Symphony, which is not a triumphant climax at all, is his real farewell to the world.
The two most important inner impulses beneath Bach's music were Ireland and love, but you can rarely say that his music is simply about either. In 1910, suddenly and passionately in love with the Ukrainian girl Natalia Skarginsky, Bach followed her to Russia. She was flirtatious but fickle and announced her engagement to someone else while Bach was still in Russia. But the splendid piano sonata that he wrote there isn't only about that wounding experience. It's also about the landscape of Russia and its bells and churches, and about the music of Balakirev and Rachmaninoff and Scriabin. Endured his loneliness in Russia, he said, accumulating impressions for future service to my art. Within 6 months of his return, he was married. The marriage didn't survive the arrival in his life a few years later of the wonderful stray creature from the fairy hills, as he called her, Harriet Cohen. But the sequence of works that he wrote in his first years with her aren't, again, simply about her or their love. They have to do as well with Ireland and the sea and what Vernon Handley called moods that are western and northern. About 10 years after leaving his wife for Harriet Cohen, Bach had dinner with an old friend, Grant Oliver, who brought along a young friend of his, a girl of 23 called Mary Gleaves.
We sat down to the meal, and I was very, very shy and could hardly look up from my meal to either look at them or to hear what they were saying, but they were quite happy talking music amongst themselves. And Grant Oliver suddenly said that Mary Gleaves, my friend Mary Gleaves, is very, very shy, so I hope you won't mind if she doesn't have much to say. And Arnold promptly said, well, I think I'll try not to move too quickly, because if I do, she may run away. And that at the end of the meal, we parted under the underground. And as we parted, Arnold walked away and turned round, and I simultaneously turned round too, and we waved goodbye to one another.
Bach had always called himself a tireless hunter of dreams, and Mary Gleaves brought him, he told her, the glamour and ecstasy of the dream world. You are the loveliest thing that ever happened to me.
1930, and he came to see me one day, and he said, oh, I've got some idea, I wonder if you will like it. I want to go off to a lovely place I know in the Highlands of Scotland to orchestrate the work I am doing, and I wonder if you would like to come with me. So I said I thought that was a lovely idea, and so off we went to that beautiful place in the northwest of Scotland called Mora. It was about October, I should say. The weather was very beautiful. Lovely, lovely sunny days. And we had a very happy time there. He doing his work, and I reading. He usually worked in the morning for several hours, 2 or 3 hours, and then we would have lunch and we would go for these long walks and come back in the evening. And it was lovely coming into the little sitting room with a huge fire burning up the chimney. We would have supper in our little sitting room, and then he would get back to working on his music, and it was then when he would ask me to read aloud to him. He would just sit down there working away, and after some pages he would look back over what he had written and start conducting, imagining it being conducted, and hearing, of course, the full orchestra that he had written down. In the summertime, we used to go to places on the Thames: Wargrave, Pangbourne, and Marlow. Marlow was the first place he ever took me to on the river, and that was quite a beautiful day, and he referred to it ever after. In fact, I think he wrote a little poem and referred to it as the green and gold day, because it was golden sunlight, beautiful green of the spring countryside. But also during these visits to the river places, usually, in fact almost always in the early summer. And he had given me the Oxford pocket book of wild flowers, and we would be walking along a lane, and I would stop by the hedgerow examining the various parsley family, trying to identify them from my book. And after 5 or 10 minutes I would get up in order to join him, and I would see him a long way down the lane, walking along with his head slightly inclined forward and one hand behind his back. He with his music, and I with my wild flowers. So there was one thing I knew, that we were perfectly happy walking side by side in absolute silence.
Bach's Fourth Symphony, written in Mora while Mary Gleaves read to him, with memories of silent green and gold days, but it is besides a symphony. It is entirely characteristic of Bach's that Harriet Cohen didn't learn of Mary Gleaves' existence for 20 years. Bach would return from Mora to Harriet and pick up another life. Which of them was he living with? The inner impulses beneath his music, I said, were love and Ireland, or something that Ireland best represented. He was 18 when he opened a volume of verse at the words, "Sad to remember, sick with years," and a few lines later, "But the tale, though words be lighter than air, must live to be old, like the wandering moon." It was W.B. Yeats's The Wanderings of Oisin.
The poetry and prose of Yeats introduced me to the Irish fairy hierarchy and to the magnificent heroic sagas of his land. There were three different earthly paradises as conceived by the ancient Gael. One, the hollow hill; two, Hy-Brasil, or the land of eternal youth, situated in an enchanted island in the Atlantic, said sometimes even now to be glimpsed from the western seaboard of Eire; and three, Moimel, the pleasant plain. I wrote tone poems about all these three pagan places of bliss. In the fairy hills, the hollow hill; the garden of Fand, Hy-Brasil, both orchestral works; and Moimel, a piece for two pianos. I think I may claim, in all modesty, that I was the first to translate the hidden island into musical terms. And all this I owed in the first place to Yeats, for his was the key that opened the gate of the Celtic wonderland, and his the finger that pointed to the magic mountain whence I was to dig nearly all that may be of value in my own art. Neither does my debt to that great man end there, for his poetry has always meant more to me than all the music of the centuries. All the days of my life I bless his name.
Bax soon became, in his imagination, more Irish than English. He found a magic place in the west of Ireland which he returned to again and again for the rest of his life, Glencolumkill, the valley of the Church of Columba, a village between towering hills looking out across the western ocean towards Hy-Brasil. The Ireland of Yeats and of the Republican leader Patrick Pearse was part of the youth that Bax spent his later life achingly remembering. The sister of Harriet Cohen, Myra Verney.
It occurs to me that one could perhaps compare Bax's involvement with the Irish cause with Wordsworth's involvement with the French Revolution, when to be alive in that age was a wonderful thing. That it was the romantic being involved in the idea of revolution, of the readjustment of injustice.
And a friend from Bax's later years in Ireland, Anne Crowley.
Arnold loved Ireland so intensely that when half his holiday was over, he began to be sad and withdrawn. From his earliest days he was accustomed to visit the West, Connemara, Donegal, and probably Kerry with his sister Evelyn. When I took him to hear famous records of Irish music, he was able to tell the collector from which county, even townland, they had come. Even the name of the fiddler who played them, or the singer who sang them. He had an extraordinary memory for anything pertaining to Ireland. He tells us again and again how it influenced his music. About the Garden of Fand, he writes, "My own favourite among all my works. I was 29 when I wrote it, and it was all literally given to me by Ireland."
The Garden of Fand. Fand, in ancient Irish folklore, being the daughter of Manannan, lord of the ocean, her garden is the western sea that Bax saw from his windows at Glencolumkill. There's so much of Ireland in Bax that some of him can only be found there. In Cork especially, which he visited every summer for many years to stay with the Fleischmann family, I felt a strong presence of Bax, talking to Alois Fleischmann, Emeritus Professor of Music at University College Cork, in the college's Bax Memorial Room, which contains, presented by Harriet Cohen, his piano, all of his published music and many manuscripts, including the piano score of a complete ballet that was quite unknown to me, Tamara.
That's very interesting, because when we got it, I wrote to Karsavina to ask her whether the ballet had been performed, because it was dedicated to her, dedicated to that divine dancer whose art has inspired this work. And her reply was astonishing. She said she never heard of it, even though she had commissioned Bax to write a work for her and knew him very well, but he never mentioned that he had written a work for her. So I presume what happened was that he decided that he would write a work for the Diaghilev Company when it was coming to London in 1912. When the company made its program known, it included Tamar by Balakirev. So Bax apparently decided, well, that's that, Balakirev has done it, so there's no point in doing any more.
But it's very curious that he should have gone to all the trouble to write this score, and then on learning that something vaguely similar was being performed, he should just have apparently dropped it without a word.
Well, it's rather typical of him. He was like that.
Did he often just leave works in his bottom drawer?
I would say so, and that's why, I mean, it was an enormous output. So little really has ultimately come to light.
So do you have other works in the collection here that are either little known or actually unperformed?
Well, Into the Twilight was done once by Sir Thomas Beecham in 1908, I think, and the next performance was with my orchestra in Cork about 10 years ago. And we've also got Kathleen E. Houlihan. That, I think, was done once or twice at the Academy, but hardly performed since then.
This room contains not only his printed music and manuscripts, but over there in another glass case, a most extraordinary collection of miscellany. Chessmen?
That's right.
Was he
he was a private chess player? Oh, yes.
And there are a number of pipes. I've certainly seen photographs of him smoking pipes.
Yes, we have a collection of his pipes.
We have here ordnance survey maps of Donegal and Enniskillen.
Exactly,
Did he know the countryside of Ireland well?
Well, he certainly knew Donegal, and he had spent a little time in Kerry. Then we brought him right around West Cork. Every year he came, we brought him on picnics, and he's enjoyed these thoroughly. Especially the Irish place names used to intrigue him, because he had quite a good knowledge of Irish, and he used to produce very fanciful notions as to how these words were derived. And sometimes a motif arising from one of these place names would crop up right through the day, like a fugal motif, you see. He was very witty and a marvellous companion.
There's a manuscript here in that language. Is that in his hand?
Yes, certainly. He started translating Synge's Shadow of the Glen into Irish with the help of a friend, a teacher in Donegal. And his Irish must have been very good, because he actually took down the words of several folk tunes, and one of these is written there in his own hand. And it requires considerable knowledge of the language to understand what a folk singer is singing. And he also there sketched his own effort to translate his name into Irish.
Oh, I see.
And he calls it Ardgil Bax, Ardgail and Bacs.
During the war I sent Arnold an Irish dictionary, knowing how he loved the language and to distract him from the bombs and planes zooming overhead. He wrote that he spent hours poring over it at night. Then followed a great attempt to write to me in Irish. When his mother died, I sent him a letter of sympathy in Irish. He wrote, "I value this letter and your prayers more than I can say. Anya, I love your Irish letters. They are more charged with feeling than anything you could write in English. Why, I don't know, but perhaps because there is a secret strangeness and intimacy in the old language, like the scent of the turf smoke on the wind."
What else do we have here?
Well, his publications, the short stories Rack and The Sisters in Green Magic and Children of the Hills, these were 3 books of short stories.
And these, of course, were published under the pseudonym of
Dermot
O'Byrne.
Yes.
And those poems suggest to me somebody not just sympathetic with Ireland, but sympathetic to the nationalist cause.
That's true. Well, his Dublin Ballad, of course, is a famous poem. Yeats said in a Dublin drawing room that it was the best poem to come out of the period in Ireland, and he said that gave him more pleasure than any praise he had ever got for any of his music.
And were not some of these poems actually suppressed at the time?
Censored, yes. Yes.
Oh, write it up above your hearth and troll it out to sun and moon. To all true Irishmen on earth, the rest and death come late or soon. And when the devils made us wise, each in his own peculiar hell, With desert hearts and drunken eyes, we're free to sentimentalize by corners where the martyrs fell. Verses from Bax's poem A Dublin Ballad, published under the pseudonym of Dermot O'Byrne and suppressed by the British authorities in Ireland. Alois Fleischmann being an authority on Irish folk music, I asked him about the much-discussed question of whether there was a truly Irish element in Bax's music.
Oh, yes, no end. For instance, there's a very fine rhapsody for viola and orchestra, which is full of Irish material. The only time he actually seemed to use an Irish folk tune was in the finale of his G major string quartet. There's a rondo there, and the second episode sounds just like an Irish tune. When it was performed in Cork, the audience said, at last he has taken an actual tune. Now, in fact, the tune is a hybrid. Bax said himself he hadn't used an Irish tune. He thought it was a tune rather characteristic of Irish folk melody. And the fact is that one of the phrases is the foggy dew, but the other phrases, they're very close to Irish folk music, but I don't think it's possible to place them. So what he did was, I think he constructed a tune which he felt to be typically Irish in the form ABBA, and that's the second episode. That gave great pleasure to the Cork audience when they heard it.
Not many books on music in Bax's collection, I noticed. Not many words about it in his conversation.
He never spoke about his music at all. You know that in Dublin, when he was consorting with Yeats and A.E. Russell, they didn't even know he was a composer. They thought he was a literary gent, because he never mentioned the fact that he wrote music. He used to produce some very eccentric notions about other people's music. His notions about the classical repertoire were very strange. Bach was sewing machine music. Schumann and Beethoven even only wrote good music when they were forming their styles. After that they repeated themselves, and in old age, well, Schumann petered out and Beethoven went in for rather sterile experimentation.
And that's a curious reflection on his own often stated fear of growing old.
Well, probably that was the reason he feared it so much. He was afraid that he would not be able to keep up his flow of composition at the same fluency that he had always been able to master. Well, I do feel that his bitterness as a result of what he felt was the neglect of his music, I think that did to a certain extent curb his creative urge.
He spoke with bitterness of that, did he?
Very little, but I did hear him say that most people now, especially the younger generation, felt that he was past his time, had become old hat.
They were sad, those last years. There were honours, yes, honorary doctorates, 2 knighthoods, the mastership of the King's music. But Bax was now, in fact, what he'd apprehensively felt himself becoming, what he'd so terribly feared. He was old. Not very old, he never saw his 70th birthday. But memory of youth was bitter, not warmly nostalgic. And although he went on composing, he was tending the embers with little hope of a flame rising, and he knew it. Alcohol dulled the pain a little. He came to rely on it more and more. And there were fewer and fewer performances in those last years. In his last summer, Mary Gleaves met him at one of them.
And he said, "Wait for me after the concert," which I did do. And when I joined him, he walked by my side and said, "Were you proud of me?" And I said, "Oh, yes, of course I was." But I was very unhappy about it, because it was a very unusual thing for Arnold to say, because he would never, as it were, draw attention to himself. And somehow on that particular occasion, he wanted to do so.
And not long after that concert, Bax went again to visit Alois Fleischmann and his wife Anne in Ireland. It was his home, if ever he had a home.
What happened was he was a student examiner to our college, and when the examinations were finished, he was taken by a friend of his to the old head of Kinsale. It was an evening, marvelous sunset, and he stood at the very tip of the old head looking out into the west. Now, he says in his autobiography that he would like to think that on his deathbed, his last vision would be the deep, brooding, dove-grey, mysterious Atlantic. And I cannot but think that while he was standing there, he must have remembered that the performance of The Garden of Fend, which we had just had in Dublin, the previous day actually, which I conducted with the RT Symphony Orchestra, and I do feel that when he looked out into the Atlantic there, the whole background of Fend must have been in his mind, because he was lost in thought, and finally he had to be roused from his reverie and brought home, and within a couple of hours he was dead. Heart failure.
He went upstairs, he'd take no help anywhere. He undressed and he washed and he went into bed. And I said, "We better get a doctor, Sir Arnold." And he said, "No, Anne, please. You know I hate fuss." Well, I said, "Still, I think you should have one." And he said no. So I left him and I went downstairs and telephoned my own professor of medicine. And I told him, and I said, "Would you come up? Because to me he's a dying man." And he arrived in a quarter of an hour. Sir Arnold was perfectly conscious. And Professor injected whatever you should do, but his heart by that time was failing too much that it didn't really get into his circulation, and he never got going properly. And there was no good in having a minister of any kind, because he always said he didn't believe in anything, that the Muslims were the nearest you could get, which was rather a shaking experience, like. And then he just thanked Professor, and he thanked me, and he turned to the wall, and in 20 minutes he was gone.
The closing bars of the Third Symphony of Sir Arnold Bax. The Golden Age has passed. A portrait of the composer was written and presented by Michael Oliver. The producer was Graham Sheffield.